May 22, 2010. 6:05 a.m. A Boeing 737 touches down at Mangalore Airport in southern India. The runway is slick with morning rain. The pilots have been in the air for nearly 4 hours. Everything seems routine. Except the captain is asleep. He has 90 seconds to realize he's about to kill everyone on board. He doesn't. 158 people die in the fireball that follows. Only 8 survive. And the black box recording reveals something that will haunt aviation forever. The first officer, the guy who's supposed to be the safety net, spent 2 minutes begging his captain to abort the landing. 2 minutes of go around, sir. Go around, 2 minutes of watching disaster unfold in slow motion, while the man in the left seat, the one with all the authority, refuses to accept reality. So how does an experienced pilot sleep through an approach and then wake up so disoriented? He flies a perfectly good airplane into the ground. How does cockpit culture get so broken that a junior pilot watches death approaching and can't force the controls away from his superior? And why does Mangalore Airport, perched on a plateau like an aircraft carrier in the sky, have a reputation for swallowing planes whole? Strap in. This one's a masterclass in how human nature, bad design, and corporate pressure can turn a routine flight into a nightmare. Let's rewind to the beginning. Mangalore International Airport. Sounds fancy, right? It's not. The locals call it a tabletop airport, which is a polite way of saying it's carved out of a hilltop with cliffs on both ends. Imagine landing a commercial jet on a mesa in the middle of a monsoon. That's Mangalore. The runway is 8,038 feet long. That's shorter than most international airports, but technically adequate for a 737. The problem isn't the length. It's what happens if you mess up. Overrun the runway to the north and you're tumbling down a rocky hillside. Oh, and there's no go-around terrain clearance on one end, meaning if you abort the landing too late, the hills might reach up and grab you anyway. Pilots hate this airport. It's got a reputation. 4 years before Air India Express 812, another flight landed long at Mangalore. The pilots stood on the brakes so hard they blew multiple tires. The plane stopped with maybe 200 feet of runway to spare. The passengers probably needed new underwear. The airline called it an incident, not an accident, because technically the plane was still in one piece. Air India Express knew Mangalore was tricky. They'd issued warnings. They'd done briefings. They'd told pilots to be extra careful, to nail their approach speeds, to touch down in the first 1,000 feet of runway. You know the basics. What they apparently didn't do was ask whether their crews were getting enough sleep. Enter Captain Zlatko Glusica, Serbian by birth, British citizen, 52 years old. He'd been flying for Air India Express since 2004, nearly 11,000 hours of flight time. The guy was no rookie. He'd flown into Mangalore before, multiple times. He knew the airport's quirks, knew the terrain, knew the risks. But on May 21, 2010, Captain Glusica wasn't just flying. He was exhausted. The trip started in Dubai at 1:54 a.m. local time, not 1:54 p.m. in the morning. The kind of departure time that makes your circadian rhythm file a formal complaint. Glusica had reportedly been awake for over 24 hours before the flight even began. Some reports suggest he'd been out partying the night before. Others say he just couldn't sleep. Either way, when he climbed into the left seat of Flight 812, he was already running on fumes. The Boeing 737-800 took off without incident. 160 passengers, 6 crew members, families heading home, workers returning from the Gulf. People with plans and futures and absolutely no idea what was about to happen. The first officer was H.S. Ahluwalia, an Indian pilot with about 3,600 hours of experience. Competent, professional, junior. That last word matters, because in the cockpit hierarchy, especially in airlines with strong cultural deference to authority, the captain is king. The first officer can suggest, can advise, can even warn, but he can't override, not easily. Not without breaking every unwritten rule about respect and chain of command. And Captain Glusica, king of this particular castle, fell asleep somewhere over the Arabian Sea. Let's be clear about what this means. This wasn't a quick head nod, a microsleep, a momentary lapse. Glusica was out cold for a significant portion of the approach. You can hear him snoring on the recording. Snoring, while the plane descends toward one of the most dangerous airports in India. First Officer Ahluwalia didn't wake him immediately. Maybe he thought the captain was just resting, that he'd snap back to alertness when needed. Maybe he didn't want to embarrass his superior. Maybe he was following that deeply ingrained instinct not to challenge authority. Aviation psychologists have a term for this. It's called cockpit gradient, the invisible slope of power that makes it psychologically difficult for a junior crew member to question or contradict a senior one. It's killed a lot of people over the years. The plane continued its descent. Air traffic control cleared them for the approach to runway 24. This is the particularly nasty one at Mangalore. It requires a steep descent over rough terrain, then a sharp correction to line up with the runway. There's no room for error. You come in high, you go around. You come in fast, you go around, you come in even slightly off center line, and you're gambling with physics. At some point, Ahluwalia woke Glusica up. The exact moment isn't clear from the recordings, but it was late. Way too late. Disoriented, confused. Imagine being ripped out of deep sleep and immediately having to land a plane carrying 166 people. Your brain is foggy. Your reaction time is shot. You're not sure where you are or what's happening. This is called sleep inertia. It's the reason your alarm clock is your enemy. And briefly forget how doors work. For most people, sleep inertia lasts a few minutes. For someone as exhausted as Glusica, it could have been worse. And he had maybe 90 seconds to shake it off and execute a perfect landing. He didn't shake it off. The approach was wrong from the start. The plane was too high, too fast, and not properly aligned with the runway. A normal pilot, a rested pilot, would have recognized this immediately. The decision tree is simple. Unstable approach equals go around. Climb back into the sky, loop around and try again. It's embarrassing. It wastes fuel. Passengers complain, but everyone lives. Glusica didn't go around. First Officer Ahluwalia knew they were in trouble. He's trying to be respectful, trying not to directly contradict his captain, but the urgency is there. Runway in sight. Glusica mumbles something. He's still waking up. We can go around, sir. The plane is descending too steeply. The automated ground proximity warning system starts screaming. Sink rate. It's the airplane's way of saying you're falling out of the sky too fast. Listen to me or we're all going to die. Glusica doesn't listen. He's fixated on landing. Maybe he's embarrassed about falling asleep. Maybe he's too disoriented to process what's happening. Maybe his exhausted brain has locked onto the idea of getting this plane on the ground and can't pivot to a new plan. Pull up, pull up. The ground proximity warning has escalated. This is the aviation equivalent of your car screaming brake. You idiot while you're about to rear-end a semi-truck. Go around, sir, go around. Ahluwalia's voice is strained now. He's not suggesting anymore. He's begging. But he still can't bring himself to physically take control of the aircraft. The cultural barrier, the hierarchy, the ingrained deference, it's all there. He's watching disaster unfold and he can't grab the controls away from his captain. This is the tragedy inside the tragedy. A competent pilot, watching from 3 feet away, knowing exactly what needs to happen, and unable to do it because the social programming is too strong. The Boeing 737 slammed onto the runway nearly 5,500 feet from the threshold. For reference, they were supposed to touch down in the first 1,000 feet. They'd already used up more than half the available runway before the wheels even hit the ground. At 162 miles per hour, way too fast. The plane bounced. This is bad. When a plane bounces on landing, it means the descent rate was too high. The angle was wrong. The energy was all messed up. Glusica should have gone around the instant the plane left the ground again. This is called a bounced landing go-around, and it's drilled into every pilot's head during training. He didn't go around. Instead, he pushed the nose down, trying to force the plane back onto the runway. The 737 hit the ground again, harder this time. The landing gear absorbed a massive impact. The brakes engaged. But there wasn't enough runway left, not even close. Here's where the math gets brutal. A Boeing 737-800 landing at the correct speed on a dry runway needs about 4,500 feet to stop. That left less than 2,600 feet of runway ahead, and the runway was wet. The plane ate through the remaining runway in seconds. The pilots stood on the brakes. The thrust reversers deployed. None of it mattered. The laws of physics don't care about desperation. At 6:05 a.m., Air India Express Flight 812 shot off the end of runway 24 at Mangalore Airport and tumbled down the hillside beyond. It slammed into a wooded gorge, shearing off wings, crumpling the fuselage, rupturing fuel tanks. Then it exploded. The fireball was visible for miles. Local villagers rushed to the crash site. What they found was hell. The plane had disintegrated. Bodies were scattered through the wreckage. The smell of burning jet fuel mixed with something worse. Most of the passengers died on impact or in the immediate aftermath. Some were killed by the fire. A few survived the initial crash only to die before rescuers could reach them. And they were thrown clear of the fuselage during the breakup. One survivor described coming to consciousness surrounded by fire, stumbling through smoke, and finding a gap in the wreckage to crawl through. Another said he heard screaming for a few seconds after the crash, then nothing but the roar of flames. First Officer Ahluwalia died. He'd spent the last 2 minutes of his life trying to save everyone on board, and in the end the hierarchy that kept him from seizing control killed him too. Captain Glusicka died. Whether he was fully awake when the plane hit the ground, we'll never know. The cockpit voice recorder captured his last moments, but those recordings are sealed. What we do know is that his fatigue, his decision to continue an unstable approach, his refusal to go around, it all added up to mass death. The investigation took months. India's Directorate General of Civil Aviation, along with international aviation experts, pored over the wreckage. They analyzed the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder, the maintenance logs, the crew schedules. They interviewed survivors, air traffic controllers, airline officials. The findings were damning. Captain Glusicka had been asleep during a critical phase of flight. This violated every rule, every regulation, every basic tenet of aviation safety. The approach was unstable from 1,000 feet all the way to impact. Any one of a dozen warning signs should have triggered a go-around. The plane touched down over halfway down the runway at excessive speed. The bounce should have been the final wake-up call. But the report didn't stop there. It also pointed fingers at Air India Express. The airline's crew scheduling practices were called into question. Glusicka's duty hours, his rest periods, the 1:54 a.m. departure time, all of it contributed to his fatigue. The report noted that the airline's culture discouraged go-arounds because they were seen as failures, as signs of incompetence. Think about that for a second. An airline that makes its pilots feel bad about choosing safety over pride. An airline where aborting a bad landing is treated as a mark of shame rather than good judgment. That's not just bad policy. That's institutionalized recklessness. The report also highlighted the lack of assertiveness training for first officers. Ahluwalia had done everything he could within the confines of cockpit culture. He'd warned, suggested, and finally begged, but he'd never been trained to forcibly take control in a situation like this. The concept of a first officer overriding a captain was so foreign, so taboo, that even with death seconds away, he couldn't do it. Aviation has a term for this too. It's called Crew Resource Management, or CRM. It's training designed to flatten the cockpit gradient, to empower junior crew members to speak up, to challenge dangerous decisions, to take control if necessary. Airlines that take CRM seriously drill it into their pilots until it becomes second nature. Airlines that don't get accidents like Air India Express 812. And then there's Mangalore Airport itself. The investigation acknowledged that the airport's design contributed to the severity of the accident. The short runway, the tabletop configuration, the terrain on both ends. All of it meant there was zero margin for error. Any pilot coming into Mangalore needed to be sharp, rested, and precise. Glusicka was none of those things. Mangalore has implemented additional safety measures, more stringent approach criteria. They've also limited operations during bad weather. But the fundamental problem remains. It's still a hilltop airport with cliffs on both ends, and it's still one of the trickier places to land a jet in all of India. Air India Express made changes too, at least on paper. New fatigue management policies, better crew scheduling, enhanced CRM training. Whether these changes actually stuck, whether they've permeated the culture, that's harder to say. Airlines are good at issuing new policies after a disaster. Following through is another story. The families of the victims sued. Compensation was paid. Memorials were built. The 8 survivors tried to rebuild their lives, haunted by the question that torments everyone who walks away from a disaster. Why them? Why did they get to live when 158 others didn't? There's no good answer to that question. Survival in a plane crash often comes down to inches, to the angle of impact, to which part of the fuselage breaks apart first. The people who died on Flight 812 weren't less lucky or less deserving. They were just sitting in the wrong seats when physics and gravity conspired to rip a plane apart. Aviation safety experts studied the crash for years afterward. In cockpit culture, in the importance of stable approach criteria, flight schools around the world now use Air India Express 812 as an example of what happens when everything goes wrong at once. The crash also reignited debates about pilot rest requirements. How many hours should a pilot be awake before flying? How long should rest periods be between flights? Should airlines be allowed to schedule red-eye departures with the same crew that's been working all day? Different countries have different rules, and the aviation industry fights against tighter regulations because they cost money. But here's the thing about fatigue. It's invisible until it's too late. A drunk pilot will slur his words, stumble during the pre-flight walk-around, maybe even get caught by a breathalyzer. A fatigued pilot looks normal right up until he falls asleep at the controls. By the time you realize there's a problem, the plane is already crashing. Studies show that being awake for 24 hours impairs your cognitive function as much as being legally drunk. Reaction times slow down. Decision-making gets sloppy. You fixate on irrelevant details and miss obvious warning signs. And if you do fall asleep and then get jolted awake, you're dealing with sleep inertia on top of everything else. You're basically drunk, hungover, and concussed all at once. Captain Glusica was trying to land a 130,000-pound aircraft in this condition, at one of the most challenging airports in India, in weather conditions that were marginal at best, with passengers who trusted him to get them home safely. He never had a chance, and neither did they. The ultimate irony is that going around would have been so easy. Push the throttles forward, pitch the nose up, climb back into the sky. Air traffic control would have cleared them for another approach. They'd have looped around, lined up properly, and landed without incident. The whole thing would have added maybe 10 minutes to the flight. 10 minutes. That's the price of 158 lives. But Glusica's exhausted brain couldn't make that call. And the corporate culture that Air India Express had created made it almost impossible for Ahluwalia to force the issue. So the plane kept descending. The warnings kept screaming, and the runway kept getting closer until there was no more time left to fix it. It's a story about systems that fail, about cultures that prioritize deference over safety, about airports built in places where planes shouldn't land, and about the cruel mathematics of kinetic energy, and how the people who pay the price are almost never the ones who made the mistakes. The wreckage of Flight 812 was eventually cleared away. The gorge where the plane crashed is quiet now. But if you visit Mangalore Airport today and stand at the end of runway 24, you can see where it happened. You can see the cliff, the drop-off, the trees below. You can imagine what those last few seconds must have been like. The realization that it's too late. The impact. The fire. And maybe if you're a pilot, you'll think twice before accepting a schedule that leaves you exhausted. Maybe you'll remember that going around isn't failure. It's survival. Because in aviation, there are old pilots and there are bold pilots. But there are no old, bold pilots who fall asleep on approach and refuse to go around when their first officer is begging them to, taking 158 people with them.